During the early colonial period in the United States, it was common to have only one chair at the table. Thus, the seat at the table was reserved for the male head of the household. As the Industrial Revolution took root throughout the world and significantly in the United States, folks were able to afford more seats. Yet, this idea of a privileged seat remained in our cultural lexicon to describe access to the halls of power, which determined the shape of the common life. Even as we celebrate the labor movement and all who work in this country, I think about brave people who have fought and are fighting for a seat at the table and an opportunity to share in the benefits and spoils of their work. In our gospel today, Jesus seems to share our concern about who has a seat at the table. In Luke's gospel, Jesus has a seat at the table of the Pharisees on 3 explicit occasions. The first meal that Jesus shares with Pharisees is in Luke 7, when Jesus is invited to the house of Simon the Pharisee. In this case, a woman who is identified as a sinner washes the feet of Jesus with her tears, dries them with her hair, and anoints them with perfumed oil from an alabaster box. When Simon comments on the fact that Jesus has allowed a sinful woman to touch him, Jesus chastises the Pharisee and presents the woman as an example of the hospitality that Simon failed to offer as his host. The second meal Jesus shares with Pharisees is from Luke 11, which we read a few weeks ago. At this meal, when Jesus is questioned for not washing properly before eating, he chastises his hosts for being so concerned with outer appearances that they have neglected the justice and generosity that God calls them to. The third and final meal that Jesus shares with Pharisees is from today's gospel. Jesus is invited to another Shabbat dinner and observes the guests jockeying for position at the table. Jesus again chastises the Pharisees. First, he counsels the whole company to act with humility when choosing their seat. And then he counsels his host to think differently about who he invites to share in his table. While there are some implicit accounts of Jesus being in the company of religious officials during meals, only Luke explicitly places Jesus in the company of Pharisees. Why is Luke so explicit about Jesus's table fellowship with the Pharisees? Luke's gospel was written sometime after 70 CE. The important thing to remember about 70 CE is that it is the year that the Temple of Jerusalem is destroyed. The destruction of the temple marked a new era in Jewish life, which saw the decline of various factions and the persistence of others. Ultimately, the Pharisees would preserve the Jewish faith that would become Rabbinic Judaism. At the same time, the disciples of Jesus would persist on a separate but parallel track that would lead to Christianity as we know it. We often emphasize what makes these two tracks unique from one another. I think that part of Luke's point is to draw attention to the distinction, but Luke makes the point through something that early Christianity and Pharisaic Judaism share: an emphasis and interest in table fellowship. In both cases, the movement away from centralized power in the temple and towards the community, and especially the home as the center of religious life, would be key to survival. In other words, the fate of each faith came down to seats at the table. Not the table at the White House or the governor's mansion or the temple, rather the kitchen tables of believers. Now, the difference comes down to who has a seat at these tables. For the Pharisees, the emphasis falls on who should be excluded from the table. In all three examples from Luke's gospel, the Pharisees make judgments about who and how one should be at the common table. For Luke, the Christian position must emphasize who should be included. Everyone. Everyone has something to share and has a share in God's table. Jesus rebukes these judgments from the Pharisees in Luke's account. Unsurprisingly, as a companion of the Apostle Paul, Luke's Jesus takes the Pauline position that the table should be a place of welcome for the poor, the marginalized, and the stranger. All who seek Christ are welcome at Christ's table. As the preacher in Hebrews exhorts a Jewish Christian community facing expulsion from their homes, persecution, violence, and uncertainty in the face of calamity, we are to persist in our love for one another and in loving one another, not neglect the stranger or the estranged. To live in the freedom and knowledge that Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There is no need to be anxious or insular in the face of trying times. We are called to be open and generous in our praise, in our good works, and in our sharing. This phrase, to share what we have, is one word in the Greek, koinonia. It is used in Acts and throughout the epistles in a variety of ways. Most notably, it is the word we translate as communion. Thus, implicit in our understanding of worship, implicit in our understanding of this table is this sense of mutuality, hospitality, fellowship, and sharing. Our sharing is not rooted in a sense of scarcity in the crumbling world. Our sharing is rooted in our sense of abundance, in and through an eternal God whose table is big enough for us all. Amen.